All right, today we're going to dive deep, and I mean really deep, into our lakes and ponds. We're on the hunt for a hidden threat, something that's lurking just beneath the surface.
You know, we've all seen that nasty green scum on the surface of a pond or a lake, but what if I told you the real danger actually begins after all that green stuff is gone? What if the biggest threat is the one you literally can't even see?
Yeah, it turns out those familiar and, let's be honest, pretty disgusting harmful algae blooms are really just the tip of the iceberg. They're the obvious symptom of a much deeper and way more troubling problem that's brewing below.
Okay, so let's start with the problem we can all see. Section 1. A plague on our waters.
So, these harmful algae blooms, or HABs for short, we're all pretty familiar with them. They're popping up more and more all over the world, and they are just bad news all around. They completely choke out aquatic life. They release toxins that can make us and our pets sick. They smell absolutely terrible, and they lead to these massive dead zones in coastal waters. A familiar story, right? But the story doesn't stop there.
Now, let's get to that hidden danger. This brings us to Section 2, the methane machine.
Okay, so here's the big twist. When all of that algae dies off and sinks to the bottom, the whole decomposition process just sucks all the oxygen out of that deep water. And this creates the absolute perfect breeding ground for bacteria that produce methane. And you know, methane is a greenhouse gas that's over 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So our beautiful lakes are quietly turning into these massive methane factories.
So how do we fix this? Well, for the longest time, the go-to solution was just to dump a bunch of chemicals into the water. But that, it turns out, often makes a bad situation even worse. It just creates more of that methane-producing sludge. The alternative? A nature-based solution. One that works with the ecosystem, not against it.
So if the old way is out, what's the new way in? Well, that brings us to Section 3, Nature's Own Solution.
I want you to meet the BioHaven Floating StreamBed. At its heart, it's a floating island that creates this gentle, oxygen-rich stream in the water. But it's not just any stream. It's a really smart, highly engineered system that's designed to use nature's own toolkit to heal the water.
Okay, but how does a floating island actually do all of this? Let's take a look inside the floating stream bed.
Now here is the secret sauce. You've got to get oxygen to the bottom of the lake where the problem is, but, and this is a huge but, you absolutely cannot just mix up the whole lake. See, most lakes have these natural layers of warm and cold water, and if you mess with those, you can cause a whole bunch of new problems for the ecosystem.
This is where the genius of the system comes in. So first, it uses this airlift technology to pull in water from a very specific depth, right above that nasty sludge layer. Then, it infuses that water with tons of tiny oxygen bubbles. And here's the really critical part. It returns that oxygenated water to the exact same depth it came from. Because the temperature doesn't change, the lake's natural layers stay perfectly intact. Pretty clever, right?
This really elegant process leads to some seriously powerful results. So let's look at the 5 keys to restoration. All right, let's break down these 5 major wins that this super-targeted approach makes possible.
First, it pinpoints the problem zone. So instead of trying to treat the entire lake, which is expensive and inefficient, it focuses oxygen right where it's needed most, down on that deep sludge at the bottom. This makes the whole process way more efficient and a lot cheaper.
Second, it traps the methane. By not churning everything up, you contain the methane that's already built up in that deep water. You stop it from escaping into the atmosphere and acting like a super potent greenhouse gas.
Third, it empowers the good guys. Creating this thin layer of oxygenated water right at the bottom creates the perfect environment for methane-eating bacteria to absolutely thrive, while at the same time, it starves out the methane-producing bacteria. It's like microbial warfare, and we're picking the winner.
And fourth, it creates a super habitat. The material of the floating island itself has this really complex surface, which becomes the perfect home for those good bacteria to set up shop and form what's called a biofilm, a whole community of microbes that makes them even better at chowing down on methane.
And finally, number 5, and this one's a game changer, it can actually help pay for itself. By measuring how much methane you're preventing from being released, you can potentially apply for carbon credits. And if you add solar panels to the system, you might even get renewable energy credits. It's a solution that's good for the environment and the bottom line.
And that brings us to our final section, which is all about the future. A solar-powered future.
The best part? This entire system can run on floating solar panels.
This creates a completely self-sustaining off-grid solution. You add some battery storage and it runs 24/7. It's totally scalable, from a tiny pond to a huge reservoir. You can even move the islands around to treat different areas. It's just an incredibly flexible and surprisingly affordable way to do things.
And, it all comes back to this one core innovation, which this quote from the source material just captures perfectly. The ability to deliver the stream back to the water body at the same temperature and depth it was drawn from. That simple, elegant idea, that's what makes everything else possible. We've been focused on the symptoms we can see on the surface for way too long. This technology makes you ask a much bigger question. Could these floating, solar-powered islands actually heal our waters? Not just by cleaning the top, but by restoring the balance from the very bottom up? Based on everything we've seen today, the answer looks incredibly promising.